Alright guys, Murph's here. Pepper came along as well. Hey Brad. And today, we're going to be talking about the 9mm and how it got to where it is. Now, we'll have to start out with a little bit of history, of course, to be able to talk about how it got to where it is here today. And that starts in 1900 with the Luger pistol, which gets adopted by the German Navy. A couple of years later, the German Army follows suit and adopts the P08 Luger again in 9mm. Now, at this time, most countries are running revolvers with large bore bullets and very short casings. And if they're not running that, they have a long list of pistols that are authorized, a couple of semi-automatics, mostly in .32 and .380 caliber, and a couple of .25 autos, which just blows my mind. I can't imagine anybody going to war with a .25 auto. Now, I've got a representative sample of some of the military cartridges in 1900, and I thought we'd go over them real quick. The Italian 10.4mm cartridge moved a 177 grain bullet at 800 feet per second and generated 240 foot-pounds of energy. The British 4.55 Webley revolver moved a 262 grain bullet at 700 feet per second and generated 285 foot-pounds of energy. The Russian 7.62 Nagant cartridge moved a 108 grain bullet at 1100 feet per second and generated 290 foot-pounds of energy. The American .38 Smith & Wesson moved a 158 grain bullet at 700 feet per second and generated 172 foot-pounds of energy. Now, honestly, .32 and .380 wouldn't be that different from these cartridges either. But the original 9mm loading was a 115 grain bullet moving at 1,160 feet per second and generated 345 foot-pounds of energy. Now, just a couple years later, the Americans would adopt the 1911 .45 ACP pistol, and that was based on experiences that they had with the .38 Smith & Wesson during the Philippine insurrection, which made them decide that they wanted to go back to a .45 caliber bore. Now, in my .40 caliber compromise video, we kind of compared .40, 9mm, .45, and talked about pretty much how 9mm and .45 are actually, and .40 for that matter, are actually fairly comparable when it comes to energy. And that's still pretty true of the Luger versus the 1911. But when you consider at the time, especially when we're talking about military applications, you're talking about a full metal jacket bullet. Well, both guns are single stack guns, and if I can only have full metal jacket, having a bigger full metal jacket bullet to throw down range makes a lot of sense. I'm going to destroy more tissue, more organs, and all that kind of stuff purely by the size of the bullet. 9mm doesn't move fast enough to get a lot of that internal hydraulic motion going on with a lot of your fluid-filled spaces when you're talking about terminal ballistics. It's not a hypervelocity round like that. So, when we hit World War I, we see the Germans using the 9mm. We see a couple other people using 9mm caliber, but different, not the 9mm Luger. They're using a different load entirely. 32s, 380s, 38s, 4.55s, all these different cartridges. And pretty much you see that trend continue in Europe even up to World War II, where you see a lot of 32s and 380s. You see the Germans stick with the 9mm, and you start to see a lot of 9mm submachine guns start to come out during this time. But in America, we still run, when it comes to like duty or police type guns, we see 1911s and .38 revolvers. Revolvers for their reliability, 1911s for their stopping power, whatever that is. Now, when it comes to the concealed carry market, you see 32s, 380s, and 25s, or stub-nose revolvers. Those are pretty much the go-to defensive guns in America. So, between the wars, World War I and World War II, we do see probably the next evolutionary step in 9mm, what kind of helps to shuffle it forward, and it's going to wind up always being one of its strengths, and that is the Browning High Power with its double stack magazine, a 13 round capacity magazine. And this kind of changes the dynamic between 9mm and 45, because as I've said before and I'll say again, handguns are not good fight stoppers. It doesn't matter what that old FUD at the gun shop tells you about being able to shoot somebody in the shoulder and the force ringing them around will break their neck and all that kind of stuff. That's not a thing. I don't even think that's medically plausible. All right. Handguns are not good at stopping fights. So if you've already inhibited yourself with a cartridge that's not good at stopping fights, it just happens to be the thing that you have available to stop the fight with, it would be kind of nice to have more of those bullets available. Maybe you can engage multiple targets within the same magazine without having to do mag changes. Once again, if you're running a single stack magazine, you better be pretty good at mag changes. But the high power does not catch on in the United States. It generates some interest in Europe, especially once we get to World War II, and you actually see the Chinese adopt it, and they turn it into kind of an ad hoc carbine with the addition of a holster that doubles as a stock, which is kind of interesting. Now, at the end of World War II, you do see a lot of 9mm submachine guns and captured handguns flow back in the United States, but for the most part, the 45 and the 38 still remain king until the 50s. So in the 50s, the first commercially produced American 9mm pistol hits the market. And that is the Smith & Wesson Model 39. Now, the Smith & Wesson Model 39 is a bit of a step back as far as capacity is concerned because it is a single stack magazine, but it's a step forward in that it's a double action, single action gun. So it does gain some initial interest in the police market, but ultimately, is it doing anything that much better than what's already on the market? That is followed up by the the Model 59, which is a 14+1 capacity 9mm handgun, also from Smith & Wesson. Now that kind of changes the dynamic. The only thing inhibiting these two guns now is that they're kind of unreliable. And they're not exactly drop safe either. So it's a little bit of a pump the brakes on the 9mm, but I like the direction that it's going. Now, in the 60s and in the 70s, you don't really see a lot of interest in 9mm aside from more submachine guns are starting to come out in that caliber. And Europe is really into the 9mm now. You're seeing a lot of guns in Europe come out in 9mm. But the US, aside from like Mac 10s and stuff like that, isn't really that interested in the 9mm until we hit the 80s. And that's when the Smith & Wesson second generation pistols come out, like the Smith & Wesson Model 459, which is a 15-round capacity gun. Well, that gains the favor of the FBI and becomes an authorized pistol for carry by agents. Well, if it's good enough for the FBI, then it's probably good enough for other police departments, and more people adopt it. And that's going great until the 1986 Miami-Dade shootout, in which I've already covered in our 40 Smith & Wesson compromise video, but suffice it to say that, just to sum it up very quickly, the FBI finds that hollow point technology is not where it needs to be with the 9mm, and that in order to have a successful hollow point, you still need more mass because you don't have a good bond between the jacket and the core of the bullet. So 9mm was not an effective fight stopper. In this case, suspects were hit multiple times with 9mm bullets and they did not go down. So you see a trend go against 9mm at this point. Everywhere but the military, because once again, the military can't have hollow points anyway. And it's already been decided that the 1911 is due for replacement, and that the guns are old, they're beat up, they're spending more time repairing them than they're spending using them, and that at this point in the 80s, there's a good possibility that handgun technology has advanced enough in order to require the 1911 be replaced. So the United States Army adopts the Beretta Model 92, and the rest of the branches follow suit. And this actually faces a lot of backlash, because once again, first off, people chafe under the idea of a non-American gun being adopted by the American military. But also the classic 45 versus literally anything else debate really pops up in earnest at this point, to where if you need 15 rounds of 9mm, then you need to learn how to shoot, because if you can't solve it at an 8, it doesn't need to be solved kind of mentality keeps popping up. And I still see it a lot. in gun shops and stuff like that when the older guys come in, and it kind of just makes me shake my head because that's not based on science. There's a lot more to ballistics, especially in handguns, than just bigger numbers. Like there's this fanciful thing called science involved. So, we fall in line with NATO and we're doing this whole adoption thing and all this kind of stuff, and everything's going really well. But the 9mm is still struggling in the United States. Now, enter Glock with the Glock 17. So now I've got a 17 round 9mm that is lighter and more durable than anything else on the market. Well, that's starting to raise some eyebrows. But of course, the FBI has already gone from the 10 mil and now by the 90s has switched over to the 40 Smith & Wesson, and a lot of police departments are following suit. So as much as they really like the concoction the Glock 17 has got going on with capacity and weight and all that kind of stuff, they really wish it was in 40 Smith & Wesson, which Glock obliges with the Glock 22. And if there was a single example that showed the 40 caliber compromise that everyone talks about, it would be the Glock 22, because you actually do have the capacity in the Glock 22 that you would normally get in a 9mm, 15 rounds in 40 Smith & Wesson. Every other 9mm on the market was 15 rounds. The Glock 17, however, was 17 rounds. So it's beating the Glock 22. It's still, even though in this one case, for the majority of the market, the Glock 22 is meeting that expectation of you get the capacity of 9 in the 40, it still is exceeded within its own catalog by the Glock 17. So it's kind of a hollow victory, or not even a complete victory, I guess you could say. And in a lot of modern loadings, as we uncovered in the 40 Smith & Wesson video, you do get the energy of 45, but you lose the mass. So at a time when you're still working with inefficient hollow points, more mass is still the better option. So that's the one thing that's got 45 really hanging on at this point. Now a double stack 45, trying to get a 45 to the capacity of 9mm is inhibitively heavy. It is not worth the effort, especially as a duty gun in most firearms. There's a couple of modern offerings, but by the 80s and 90s, there's nothing. There's para-ordnance and they're boat anchors. But at the very least, you still have a properly performing hollow point. The 40 Smith & Wesson at least has that capacity and still performs better than 9mm in hollow points right now at this point, but isn't as good as the 45. So there's a compromise to be had there. It's just not the compromise. It's not as good of a compromise as everyone thinks it is. Now, the one thing that you find in the 90s, in the early 2000s, is that 9mm is cheap, it is available, and it is low recoiling. Even in the lightweight frames of the Glocks that are coming out, the 9mm is an extremely manageable cartridge. And that has a lot of very enticing opportunities, especially when you're a police department. So you can acquire more ammunition for training, you can acquire more ammunition to make sure that your officers remain proficient, and it's easier to train new shooters on the lighter recoiling gun. 40 Smith & Wesson has some advantages to it, but for the most part, it is a very snappy recoiling firearm, which makes it kind of difficult to teach new shooters to shoot on. The 45 isn't necessarily snappy, but it's a very heavy gun, which can make it very difficult to carry for long periods of time, especially when you consider that you're still only getting a single stack capacity. I feel like I'm kind of beating that horse to death here right now, but I've had this debate and I've seen this debate so many times over the years, and a lot of times I see a lot of emotion and a lot of personal investment get involved in the situation, and I want to boil this down more to just facts, to things that actually apply to your average shooter. So the thing that really redefined 9mm was an updating in our capabilities with metallurgy. Once we got 9mm to the point that it could reliably expand 50% of its size and maintain 100% of its weight in a target, that completely changed the game. Because now I had a viable, lighter, higher capacity offering that could put down the targets just as good as 40 and 45 could, and it could do it at a reduced weight and a higher capacity and a reduced cost and all this. This entire, it's no longer a compromise. You're actually getting a lot of the best possible outcomes that you could hope for all in one cartridge. And that's what the 9mm became. For the most part, what you see are a lot of people kind of digging in their heels based off of older information and what they've already invested their time and money in off of, again, old data, not taking into account where science has gotten us with metallurgy and all that kind of stuff, to where we are today, where every time there is an ammo shortage, 9mm is foremost among it because that's what people have. There are gun shops in my area that will not even take trade-in 40 cals and will not even buy new 40 cals to put into their cases because 9mm is more popular. That's what they sell more of. They sell more bullets. They sell more guns. The Glock 19 has to be the quintessential cross-section of lightweight, high capacity, cheap, readily available ammunition, just all of the positives. That's why you see everyone always throw out, like, your first handgun should be a Glock 19. Glock 19 this, Glock 19 that. You see it so often because it's just simple. It's the Toyota Camry or Honda Civic of the gun world. So ultimately, that kind of shows how 9mm has gotten to the point of being at its epitome of success. It has never been more popular than it is right now. It has never been more ballistically viable than it is right now. And I only foresee it continuing to go up. We've seen the reduction in 40 Smith & Wesson popularity. 45 will never really go away because there is something about a 45, and you also have your old diehards, which they refuse to go away. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen that old guy throw his head back and loudly announce that he prefers to carry a 45. Or that same guy at the counter talking about the 40 caliber being, the capacity of a 9 and the knockdown power of a 45. I've seen them all. These debates may continue into infinity, but the reality is that it's kind of moot because ultimately 9mm is perfectly viable. And we see that every day in its sales alone. Alright guys, that's pretty much what I have. I think that's the end of my rant. If I go any further, you might stop listening if you haven't already. So, I guess I'll see you guys next time.